In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. All of the Gospels have a very prominent place in this resurrection narrative that we have this Easter morning for Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, as you remember from the Gospels, is the one, it says, the one from whom 7 demons were driven out. It's sometimes thought, or she's sometimes said to have been a prostitute, but there's nothing in the New Testament which says that. So it might be very unfair to say that. But it does say that she had 7 demons that were cast out. So there's some, and we don't know what that means either, but there's some kind of shadowy background that she has in her life, and that at some point in her relationship with Jesus Christ, those demons were driven out, and then here in this resurrection scene this morning, she's put into the primary place here. And indeed, she had been, while Peter and the other disciples, most of them, had fled from the cross because they were afraid, she didn't flee. She stayed there with Jesus' mother, and with Salome, and with John the Evangelist. So she had not only some kind of deep relationship with him, some kind of healing relationship that she'd had with Jesus Christ, but there's this tremendous faith and courage in her faith. And so here we get to Easter morning, and the first of the resurrection appearances is to her in this very beautiful, beautiful scene, which is just this almost poetic. It's a literary kind of jewel, really. To think that you see her weeping with sadness. She's misunderstanding. She thinks he's been stolen. And here, she's racked with grief. And here she seems to be the only one that is there at that moment. So upset about the fact that there's been a grave robbery here, that they've taken his body away. And then another misunderstanding, that Jesus is standing there, but she just can't recognize him until he says her name. And when he, whatever it was like, the way he said her name, then she knew who he was. It's just a beautiful picture of it. And then she responds with Rabboni, which means teacher, or my great one, my great one. So Mary, from that shadowy background, not only had this healing relationship with Jesus, not only had this courageous journey, but here she has this encounter with him in the garden. Now, yesterday night, the Easter Vigil begins last night, and it goes through to this morning, the dawn service. It's meant to be a kind of all-night thing. And the most important reading in it is the same, overlaps with the Passover feast of the Jews, and that is the reading of the passage from Exodus, chapter 20, where the Israelites escaped from Egypt, the Passover reading. And it's a wonderful sort of echo of that, because Moses himself had to be called from a shadowy background. Remember, Moses was a murderer. We don't know what the shadowy background was for Mary Magdalene, but we do know that Moses, is a very bad man to have killed somebody. You wouldn't like to have a murderer for a friend. It would make you very uneasy. But here, from this shadowy background that he has, God calls to him. He has to run away into the desert, 40 years in the desert of looking after sheep. That's what you call probably a down curve in his career. And then God calls to him by name. And when he hears God's call to him, then he becomes this figure, historic figure, one of the great figures of history, who leads the Israelites out of Egypt in the name of God. And so way back there you have Moses, whom God calls from that tortured background to lead his people. And here we have Mary Magdalene, who from her shadowy background, Jesus calls her name, and she here becomes the first apostle. She is the first one that Jesus says to her, go and tell my brothers, it says here, go and tell my disciples what you have seen, that I have risen from the dead. They obviously didn't understand that either. They saw the empty tomb, but they didn't understand what had happened. She had to carry the message to them. And so, ahead of St. Peter, ahead of St. Paul, ahead of all the other apostles, here is Mary Magdalene, given this primary place among all Christians in the mission to which she is sent. And it's really a beautiful, beautiful picture of her. And she hears his name. First of all, she doesn't understand. Then she does understand when he says to her, Mary. Suddenly it seems like she realizes it's Jesus. And then he sends her on her mission. Same thing happened to Moses. Same kind of thing happens to other people. And I was thinking of C.S. Lewis, who's that famous, one of the most well-known writers, Christian writers, theologians of the 20th century. And he also had his shadowy side. He said that when he was 9 years old, his mother died, and it seemed in the book Shadowlands, he describes the bleakness of those years, and yet he found new life in Jesus Christ. And so he also was sent on this mission to be this great writer that we have in the Christian community. And I think it applies not only to these men and women, but really also to young people. You know, when you think also of the call of Samuel as a boy, he also couldn't understand at the beginning God's call to him. He had to keep going to Eli to say what had happened, until Eli realized that was God speaking to him. It's like he also had to learn to listen to God. Moses had to learn that. Mary Magdalene had to learn that. And little Samuel had to learn that. We all have to learn it. We don't, first of all, understand that tone of God. We don't at first understand what God is saying to us. We hardly know when God is speaking to us. But slowly, as we journey behind Jesus Christ, we learn the language of God. We learn the poetry and the music of the Spirit. So the challenge, I think, to us here on this wonderful Easter morning, Jesus, here in the same gospel, St. John writes this: the sheep hear his voice. The sheep hear the voice of Jesus as he calls by name those who belong to him. Fear not, for I have redeemed you, says God in Isaiah chapter 53. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. So this Easter morning, can you hear God calling you by name? Do you know what that sounds like? In the name of Christ, amen.